Welcome viewers to this series of lectures on European history. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach at the Department of History in Hindu College, University of Delhi. I have been speaking to you about the rise of the absolutist states in general. Also, we have had quite a few sessions on that. And I have earlier spoken to you about the rise of absolutist state in France also. Now, this particular interaction is in continuation to what we have discussed earlier, and therefore, what I propose to do, as you can see on your slide, first we will just do a quick recap of whatever we have covered with respect to France in absolutism, and then these points are listed. Aspects of the French Revolution, French absolutism, the debate regarding the timing of the beginning of absolutism in France, some of the significant personalities associated with it, Michel de L'Hopital, Richelieu, Louis XIV, and Colbert. So we would be talking about them. Then we would also speak about the cultural factors that could be held responsible for the spread and deepening of French absolutism across 16th and 17th centuries. And then finally, we would try to assess to what extent we can regard absolutism in France as actually absolutist. So that would be some kind of a assessment, critical assessment of it. So I don't know if that can be covered in one interaction. Maybe it takes two interactions to do that. But let's begin with recapping what we have covered. And I have spoken to you about absolutism, the timing of it. For example, historians generally put it around 16th and 17th centuries, and in the case of France, particularly from 1660s onwards, because that's the period when Louis XIV, the iconic absolutist monarch of France, had come into his own after his you can say pre-adulthood period was over for around 10 to 20 years, and then from 1661 he started ruling as an adult ruler. And in the conventional historiography around the absolutist phase, particularly in France, that is regarded as the beginning. So it is generally in terms of the willpower of an individual monarch that this particular phenomena is attributed to. So absolutism is, in the conventional writing, absolutism results from the extraordinary will to control and command by Louis XIV, the French monarch. But there are views that locate, and we shall be talking about it, the beginning of the French Revolution, the French absolutism to a century even prior to it. So all across 16th century, there are some features that are very much evident, and we would be talking about it. And so it emerges, therefore, that Louis XIV built on that, something that was already on as a kind of a process where the monarchy was gradually trying to increase and intensify its control over and beyond the traditional realm to which monarchical power was limited in the feudal times. So 16th century developments allowed several monarchies, even prior to Louis XIV, to basically reach out to those domains of governance that had eluded monarchy in the centuries prior to it. Maybe it was an all important church till around that point of time. That was more important. Maybe it were the feudal lords who were more important for certain localities in terms of governance, administration of justice, taxation, and so forth. And gradually you find that deliberate attempts are being made to penetrate those realms of secular governance that had hitherto eluded monarchy. So, in that sense, there is some kind of a prehistory to what Louis XIV came to do with respect to intensification and expansion of monarchical power. And in that respect, we shall talk about several personalities even prior to Louis XIV and during Louis XIV's period who were important, and we shall devote a little bit of time on that. Then, of course, we will be talking about the cultural factors and critical assessment of absolutism. So, let's get going on this. Now, as you can see, to begin with, we all know through our previous discussions to what we are trying to talk about. Absolutism. We have spoken about the backdrop of absolutism. We have spoken about Protestantism and its you can say leveraging by the monarchies to expand their power in political terms and so forth. We have spoken about the increased money making and upcoming bourgeoisie and trade and commerce and overseas expansion of trade and commerce that's happening in Europe, and that allows the monarchies to even tap as revenue the domains that were just not available to them during the feudal period on account of diminished trade and commerce. So, in all these backdrops, what we get to see is that overall, if you assess the French absolutism, then it was a weak economic condition that underpinned French Revolution. It was not a very thriving, very easy, seamless expansion of revenue base on which this French absolutist power was premised. So, French absolutism always remained in a dilemma, quite like Spanish absolutism, and the financial system in France during absolutist phase was very complex and not very efficient. So, one thing that emerges as very evident is that the bureaucracy that manned the administration of monarchical power was quite weak to begin with, and there were two types of revenue that accrued to the monarchs or monarchies. One, of course, is the ordinary usual rent from the feudal domain of various feudal lords, and that was traditional. That had always been there ever since the feudal times. But what marks as something distinct during the 16th century or 17th century French history is incidence of an extraordinary revenue mechanism, or you can say tail, and we have spoken about it earlier also, where this was a wartime measure. France was at war all across 14th century and so, and therefore wartime exigencies meant that the monarchies required more revenue to fill its coffers, to sustain war efforts, and that called for institutionalization of an extraordinary revenue measure in the form of taille. And this was very unscientifically done in the sense that this taille was imposed on the already tottering peasantry, and the first two orders, the clergy and the nobility, were somewhat exempt from paying taille, and therefore what you find is that the most vulnerable of the sections in terms of paying revenue are the ones who have been loaded, who have been burdened with a number of taxes. Yet another tax that we get to see during this period is Gabel, and that was like salt tax, and the implication of this can best be understood in regional terms. For example, there were several revolts against the feudal militia who wanted to collect Gabel or salt tax from the common people, and this was particularly evident in Western France. We have the example of the revolt of 1542, when the magnitude of the revolt was so intense that the king had to intervene and crush it. Similarly, the revolt of Petaula was also an important revolt related to the incidence of Gabel or the salt tax. All these things I am telling you just to give you a sense of the burden that the peasantry, French peasantry, was already carrying when absolutism as a process was on. Similarly, over and beyond Gabel, you have aids, which is like sales tax. It was levied on commodities that entered market, and therefore, overall, the French absolutism developed at the cost of peasant exploitation, and therefore, several historians regard it as nothing more than a feudal monarchy or feudal aristocracy, feudal monarchy or feudal absolutism. So there is no you can say structural change associated with this kind of political power that emerged during the absolutist phase in the 16th and 17th century France. There is no reordering of society and so forth. It was a pre-existing system of peasant exploitation as it happened in feudal times, and you have a supra structure of monarchy that gets mounted on the same underlying situation. So there is no restructuring either economic or social in real sense of the term, and that is what is the contention of quite a few historians, and therefore they tend to regard it as nothing more than a feudal monarchy. Although this feudal monarchy was different from the earlier feudal monarchies in the sense that the king had now more power with respect to its bureaucratic presence, with respect to its revenue access, with respect to several other interventions vis-a-vis church and so forth. But essentially it remained feudal in nature, in the sense that it didn't do much to alleviate the concerns of the peasantry, and the peasantry continued to be under the duress of several taxes and rents and feudal rents and so forth. It did cut into the power of the feudal lords, but their social prestige and political prestige was somewhat kept intact, and all those things we'll discuss as we proceed. Now, so eventually, after having discussed the tax types, we find that there are three types of taxes that the French peasantry was paying. One, of course, I have just discussed, taille, which was of course going to the state coffer. Remember, it was introduced as a wartime measure, but it continued ever since, and that was an important tax base for sustaining the extraordinarily large bureaucratized absolutist state that came to develop, that came to flourish. Similarly, second is the Signatorial Tax, and this tax actually went to the feudal lords and not to the state. And then you have dimes, and dimes actually went to the church. So it's a religious tax that we are talking of. So this point, as you can see on your slide, we have already discussed that the revenue system, the way it developed in France, was fairly inflexible and unsustainable. Why? Because it was being made incident on a section that was already burdened. So it was not very long term sustainable kind of an arrangement that was made. And therefore, what you find is that French absolutism or French absolutist monarchies kept moving towards total bankruptcy, and that became very evident on the eve of the French Revolution in 1789. So it was the bankrupt situation of the state coffers that actually led to the French Revolution. The kind of solutions that they thought of actually triggered the kind of reaction that we generally study in the form of French Revolution. The other component beyond taxation, of course, is judiciary. And French kings in absolutist monarchical period emerged as the first and foremost judge. And but there were three tiers of judiciary that was in operation during absolutist phase. Prévots or vicomtes had been operating at the local level, at the base level, and they had very limited power, and usually it dealt with simple cases. Now, over the prévots and vicomtes, we have bailies or bailliage, which was rather strong. It also had military power over and beyond the judicial power that essentially it was for. It was appointed by the state, so it becomes an instrument in expansion of absolutist power, and it appealed cases to higher courts as well. So it was a structure beyond the local level, and it was entrusted with the duty of publishing royal decrees. And as is very evident, it became very instrumental in establishing royal power over France. So this particular stage of the judiciary, or this layer of judiciary, second layer of judiciary, was instrumental in establishing French absolutism. And at the top, over and beyond the first two layers, happened to be the parliament. Now, this parliament is different from parliament, as this is a French word, and the way we understand about the English word parliament or English institution of parliament, this is different. This is parliament, and it was entrusted with judicial cum administrative functions. It had interventions. It used to make interventions on national issues also. We study about what the French parliaments had to do even during the French Revolution in 1789 and thereafter. But we are talking of the 16th and 17th centuries, and in 1515 actually 7 parliaments existed in France, and the oldest of them, which was also the most respected, was the Paris Parliament. And we also have several instances where the parliaments actually protested against royal absolutism, and the best example is the Fronde Revolt in the mid 17th century, which had a critical role to play so far as increase of royal power under Louis XIV French absolutism is concerned. Now, in 1552, Henry II established a new tier between the bailies and the parliament. So, between the second and the third layers, the second and the top layer, you can say, Henry II tries to introduce a new layer, and that was called Presidio. With the of course, the stated motive was different from the actual motive. The actual motive was just to be able to sell some more posts of these judicial officers and earn some kind of political capital and money as well. So it was part of a corrupt practice of selling posts. The middle class lapped onto it because by buying these posts, they could imitate the ways and methods of a nobility, and they could appear as nobility, and that's where the money came from. And of course, the stated logic was that it was being done for cost cutting and it was politically expedient and so forth. But as we just discussed, the actual motive was a little bit different. Now, 11 provinces in France had governors as its heads, and this is important. This was traditional way in which provinces in France were governed. And but all across 16th and 17th century, what we find during the absolutist phase, that they were compelled, these governors were compelled to devote time at the royal court. And this compulsion of staying at the royal court ensured that their duties and positions were overtaken by a new set of officials referred to as intendants. Now, intendants are important because they also went on to become a very crucial mechanism and institution by which the French royal monarchs actually extended their power and intensified their control. So, laced with administrative, military and police powers came the intendants, almost replacing the governors as the heads of various provinces. And they in the contemporary writings also are referred to as royal pillars. They are the ones who actually became the conduit through which absolutist power of French monarchy was exercised. Now, this brings us to the next aspect of the French Revolution, and that was the French the French absolutism, and that is the 16th century debate or 1660 timeline. 1660, as is very evident, is the time, as I told you in the beginning, that Louis XIV, the iconic French ruler, had become adult and he started asserting power. One set of historians regard this period as the beginning of French absolutism, whereas, as I told you, there are several historians, as you can see on your slide, Georges Pages, who says that 16th century monarchs were as powerful as the later rulers, and hence the beginning of French absolutism can be regarded from 16th century, and there is no need to wait till the adulthood of Louis XIV was actually arrived at. And Henry Pentout says that the term absolutist monarchs actually came into vogue with Louis XIV and not before, and therefore you have two diverse viewpoints that you can cite in order to understand as to what historiography does with the timeline of French absolutism. You have also J. Russell Major, who says that given the feudal dynastic structure and also decentralization, that was order of the day all across 16th century. So given these realities, 16th century monarchies were popular and consultative rather than absolutist. So he doesn't quite agree with labeling the 16th century French monarchies as absolutist, because he discovers them to be more populist and more consultative, particularly in the matters of foreign policy, and he gives one example of 1526 when France was defeated by Spain, and the king had to actually bail himself out by resorting to this explanation that he has to consult the nobility before handing over a particular province to Spain. And therefore it appears that French monarchy at that point of time was more consultative and not very absolutist, and the role was very participative so far as nobility are concerned. And therefore it had to ultimately depend on popular rather than military strength, and this led to the growth of representative institutions that of course cut into the very idea of absolutist monarchies. And then you have R.J. net, who says that consultation wasn't a regular phenomena. He gives you several examples. For example, he says that but for the 1526 instance where the Council of Nobility was called to reject the offer of handing over Burgundy, which was a province that was to be given to Spain because Spain had emerged victorious in the war against France, we hardly have any instance of Eta Genero being called for consultation, and hence 16th century monarchs too didn't quite care for representative institutions or traditional representative institutions, and therefore they can legitimately be regarded as absolutist. So that is about the timing of this beginning of the French absolutism. So you have opinions divided between its beginning from 16th century and its actual beginning from the time of the adulthood of Louis XIV, and the subsequent part of it we shall discuss in some other interaction. Thank you.